Grüß, willkommen in einem Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 12 of my organisational series. In this video I'll provide a view of the Russian World War II brigades, divisions and core combat strengths and how they changed as the war progressed. For this video I'll be using the point system from the Corps Commander set of rules. The point systems is based largely on physical attributes of the various weapon systems such as armour thickness, gun penetration rates, weight of fire, speed, special combat features and so on. Viewers need to understand that 100 points of tanks will operate very differently from 100 points of infantry. Thus, comparing tank battalions with infantry battalions needs to be done through a subjective filter. However, comparing a tank battalion in 1942 with one in 1945 is valid. All points values are divided by 250. It must be remembered that while figure gaming points provides a rough way of ensuring force mixes are balanced, they can never be perfect. If one formation is 1000 points and the other is 1001 points, it does not mean the latter will win any conflict. As a result, it's best to look at this value several orders of magnitude higher. Thus, divided by 250 gives you a simple value where you can be certain a value of 2 is clearly inferior to a value of 3. Russia's involvement in World War II probably, or most certainly, started with their conflicts with Japan in mid-1939. This was followed by their invasion of Poland in 1939, specifically in September 1939. The final involvement before the German invasion was their disastrous winter war with Finland, which occurred between November 1939 and March 1940. In 1939, the Russians possessed a number of rifle brigades, which were small and light independent formations. They were reasonably balanced and effective. The brigade was simple, with the indirect force consisting of 2 mortar and 1 light gun battalions. It also possessed an anti-tank battalion. The infantry battalion was small by the infantry division standards, however. The bulk of the infantry was formed into divisions. The Russian Infantry Division of 1939 was organised along Western principles, making it large and complex. Unfortunately, after the purges, the Russians lacked the officers to manage this formation effectively. By the standards of other combatants, this was a large infantry division. The support battalions were rather weak, but the infantry battalions were strong by even Western standards, specifically German. In 1939, the standard tank or armoured formation was the brigade, and the Russian standard tank brigade was its light tank brigade. The light tank brigade consisted of 1 reconnaissance, 1 motor infantry, and 1 tank battalion, with support from mixed mortar battalions. It was a decent-sized brigade. Initially, the Russians placed their heavy tanks into special heavy tank brigades. By 1941, this was generally abandoned. The heavy tank brigade consisted of a single heavy tank battalion, which was reasonably strong, supported by a brigade support formation. This did not prove very successful in Finland. When the Russians fought the Japanese in Mongolia, the Russians formed reasonably mixed tank brigades, which contained reasonable support formations. The tank brigade which fought in the east was, in theory, a light tank brigade, but it was generally called just a tank brigade. Also in the east, Zhukov formed mechanised brigades, which were used in conjunction with the tank brigades. They proved highly effective against the Japanese. The mechanised brigade consisted of a motorised infantry regiment supported by an armoured car battalion and a mixed mortar battalion. In June 1941, Germany attacked Russia, which started an epic land conflict which lasted until May 1945. After the initial advances in the north and centre, the Germans swung south and pocketed the Russian southern forces between August and September 1941. The rifle brigades did not change much after the reforms initiated after the Finnish War, which was comparatively minor. The primary difference was a slight reduction in the brigade support formations. When we look at the infantry divisions, while some changes occurred after the disasters in Finland, the division was still too large and complex considering the lack of experienced officers available. The changes which did occur were the light tank battalion was replaced with a reconnaissance battalion consisting of infantry and trucks. The infantry regimental support and infantry battalions were reduced in strength as well. Soon after the German invasion of Russia, the Russians began to form emergency divisions. The first emergency divisions formed were little more than a horde of riflemen. The engineers, anti-tank, howitzers battalions were removed, and the infantry battalions were little more than men with rifles. The light tank brigade, or basically tank brigade, experienced some major changes after the Finnish campaign, but not significant. The only changes which occurred were the motorised rifle battalion strength was reduced, but was otherwise similar to the earlier brigade that could be found in 1939. The heavy tank brigade proved less than useful in Finland, and most of the modern heavy tanks were merged into the new tank divisions. However, the old tank or heavy tank brigades were retained. Apart from the upgrades in the heavy tank, this formation did not change very much. In August, the tank brigade experienced a major change after the German invasion. It increased in complexity as after the tank's divisions were destroyed, they represented the primary armoured formation of the Russian army. The tank brigade gained an anti-aircraft battalion, and the army was organised into a regiment consisting of a light battalion and a medium battalion. Prior to August, the primary armoured formations in the Russian army were the tank divisions. After seeing the successes of the Germans in France, the Russians formed tank and mechanised divisions. In principle, they were reasonable formations, but a lack of skilled officers and the rapid changes in organisation resulted in a barely functioning division. The tank division consisted of one motorised infantry regiment, one medium tank regiment, and one light tank regiment. Supporting this was a motorised artillery regiment of 2 battalions. The battalions were of average strength. The mechanised division had 2 motorised regiments and 1 tank regiment. After a short period of reorganisation after the Kiev pocket, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon in October, which took them to the gates of Moscow. The German invasion resulted in the Russians forming emergency rifle brigades. However, due to its initial simplicity, this did not have a major impact and was not particularly successful. The emergency rifle brigades which the Russians formed after the German invasion lacked the heavy mortar battalion, but was otherwise unchanged, which meant it was basically a horde of infantry with rifles and some light mortars. In October 1941, the Russian emergency divisions, or the divisions which the Russians had to raise a large number of very quickly, were modified. Due to a lack of experienced troops, these were still rather simple formations which lacked normal support, but were certainly better than the earlier emergency divisions. The anti-tank battalion was removed, the engineer and anti-aircraft battalion was added back after being removed, a mortar battalion was added, the infantry regiments gained a mixed mortar battalion. This was beginning to look more like a moderately well-balanced formation, even if it was rather weak. For completeness, I've also added a cavalry division, which I generally will not cover in any great detail, but they were reasonably significant in the latter 1941 period. The cavalry divisions were simple, basically cavalry battalions supported by some light guns and other support formations. After the tank divisions were disbanded, additional focus was put towards the tank brigades, and in September 1941 the tank brigades experienced additional changes, increasing the amount of motorised infantry specifically. The infantry or motorised infantry battalion under the tank brigade command was beefed up and a motorised infantry regiment was added, making this almost like a mini division, which was really the objective. The tank brigades went through yet another change in December 1941, which was rather unusual. Due to heavy losses of tanks, the number of tanks had dramatically dropped. Yet to ensure the brigades were ready when new tanks arrived, the brigades were not merged or disbanded. The result was an unusually weak tank brigade. This version of the tank brigade was a very small formation, one weak motorised infantry battalion and a weak tank battalion. But at least when the new tanks were available, they could instantly be slotted into this structure, and the officers and the structure and the infrastructure was available to take them. By December, the infantry divisions were gaining experience and additional support formations were being added back to them. But other formations, on the other hand, were removed in order to centralise them into larger formations. Let's look at the specific changes. The engineers were weakened yet again to the point that they rounded to zero in this particular analysis. The anti-aircraft battalion and reconnaissance battalion was removed, no doubt to be centralised. The anti-tank battalion was added back. A rocket artillery battalion was also added. While there was some adjustment in the infantry regiments, their strength remained much the same. In December 1941, the Russians launched their winter offensive, which did retake ground and caused significant losses among the Germans. After the winter offensive ran out of steam, that is the Russian winter offensive, the Germans launched their 1942 summer offensive. By the beginning of 1942, the infantry brigades had returned to their standard structure. The Russians did depend on these formations a great deal at this point in time, as they were simple to raise and field. By 1943, they became less important as the divisions became more effective, and in 1944, many were disbanded to resolve manpower issues in the rifle divisions. But in 1942, they were very important. The Rifle Brigade regained its mortar battalion, which had been removed earlier, and its support was beefed up. It was now more powerful than the pre-invasion Rifle Brigade. After 7 months of dramatic changes, the infantry divisions had reached a level of stability. The Russians were still experimenting with removing and adding formations, and this division structure was no different. In May 1942, the AA battalion was added back. A machine gun battalion was also added. Otherwise, the division remained much the same. After the massive changes in the previous 9 months, this was relatively stable. In March 1942, the Russians deployed their new divisional-sized armoured divisions, the Tank Corps, basically a formation with 3 former independent tank brigades. The initial Tank Corps consisted of a motorised infantry brigade and 2 tank brigades. The battalion-level formations were all reasonably weak. In November 1942, the Russians launched Operation Uranus and Operation Saturn. The Russians did form airborne brigades, which conducted airdrops during the Russian winter offensive. They achieved reasonable levels of success, but did suffer very heavy losses. The airborne brigades were very small and very weak, and did not have much heavy weapons at all. The rifle divisions experienced another round of changes, in this case in July 1942. This reversed some of the earlier changes. The manpower problem was beginning to cause major issues, and adjustments to the structure of the division had to be made accordingly. The anti-tank, rocket artillery and heavy mortar battalions were removed, but an extra light artillery battalion was added. The infantry regiments experienced a drop in combat strength, specifically due to a lack of manpower. The initial tank corps had been destroyed in the summer, but lessons were learned, and the new tank corps were organised for the Russian counter-offensive during the winter of 1942. The new tank corps gained an armoured car battalion under corps command. The motorised infantry brigade support was beefed up, as was the motorised infantry battalion. The tank battalions were divided into a light and medium, with the medium battalion gaining combat strength due to the better and much more medium tanks that were equipping it. The Russians were also deploying a new motorised or mechanised formation, in this case the Mechanised Corps. The Russians deployed their first Mechanised Corps in September 1942. The Mechanised Corps were much larger than the Tank Corps, but were not specifically designed for exploiting a breakthrough. Their purpose was to follow the Tank Corps to counter any German counterattacks. Unlike the Tank Corps, the Mechanised Corps had significant corps support formations from engineers, anti-tank, reconnaissance, rocket artillery, anti-aircraft and artillery. There was one tank brigade which did differ slightly. Most Western Lend-Lease tanks were placed in this formation due to their reliability rather than their combat effectiveness. There was also a mechanised brigade which had a tank regiment added to it. This regiment was reasonably powerful. After the success of the 42-43 winter offensive, the Russians extended this offensive too far and suffered when the Germans counterattacked in May 1943. The structure of the infantry or rifle division remained reasonably stable, but manpower was continuing to cause a major issue, resulting in the reduction of men in some formations. The strength of the machine gun battalion was reduced until it rounded down to 0 in our analysis. The strength of the infantry regiment dropped again mainly due to a reduction in manpower. The Russians also formed Guards infantry or rifle divisions, which were divisions that did quite well and got some additional focus. The Guards infantry divisions were exempt from the reducing manpower issue, at least initially. The Guards Rifle Division Machine Gun Battalion retained its old strength, as did the infantry regiments. At this point, the Guards infantry divisions were the same as the older standard infantry divisions. Manpower had not been reduced. The Tank Corps in December was once again adjusted with an increase in corps level formations. The Armoured Car Battalion was beefed up and a Rocket Artillery Battalion was added. The Motorised Brigade was increased in strength. The Tank Brigades remained unchanged. In January, there was yet another reorganisation of the Tank Corps, and as a result, the Tank Corps got additional formations attached to it, specifically support formation. It was beginning to look more than just a collection of brigades, and was beginning to end up being something that was a true divisional size formation. The largest change was the addition of significant additional formations under corps control, which was always an issue in the past. The Armoured Car Battalion was replaced with a motorcycle battalion. A mortar regiment and an self-propelled anti-tank regiment was also added. The motorised infantry brigades were unchanged. The tank brigades gained strength due to better tanks and a high proportion of medium to light tanks. In January 1943, the mechanised corps experienced some changes. The mechanised corps were growing rapidly with additional formations added. The main change here, similar to the Tank Corps, was the addition of additional corps-level support formations. While there was no changes to the corps support or artillery regiments, a mortar regiment and an assault gun regiment was added under corps command. The tank and mechanised brigades remained unchanged. The changes in the mechanised corps in January were minor, and as February came around, the Russians were once again modifying the structure of the mechanised corps, although once again it was a minor change. It must be pointed out that different mechanised corps often use different org structures. At the scale of our analysis, there was no visible changes to the corps level support formations, artillery regiments, mortar regiments, assault gun regiments, or the mechanised brigade. Most of the changes were tweaking that tended to be invisible at this scale. The only visible change was the tank brigade support was beefed up, which was similar to what occurred in the Tank Corps. In June 1943, the Russians were defending against the expected German 1943 offensive, and while they did suffer significant losses, they managed to hold the Germans at bay and push them back. The Russians were experiencing significant manpower issues, so in order to compensate for this, the Russians began to add more complex and heavier weapons back into the division, rifle division, to compensate for this reducing manpower. This required high levels of experience in training. The machine gun battalion was officially removed from the Guards Rifle Division, but the artillery gained an additional battalion. Otherwise, the division remained much the same at this scale anyway. By June 1943, the tank corps were highly experienced and formidable armoured forces. They still had issues defending against German counterattacks, and did suffer significant losses as a result. The Tank Corps in May experienced some changes at corps level, with the composition of the anti-tank forces changing, but was otherwise much the same. The Russians were still adjusting this structure on a very regular basis. While the core formations experienced some minor changes which is not visible and was basically similar to the prior Tank Corps, an assault gun battalion was added. The infantry brigade received some additional support formations. The tank brigades did not change at all. In May 1943 there were some changes, but basically the mechanised brigade remained much the same, but was slightly altered to meet current conditions. More fine-tuning basically. Because the German Air Force was becoming less of a threat and German infantry strongpoints more of a problem, this mechanised corps lost an anti-aircraft battalion but gained an assault gun battalion. As you can see, there was no major changes to the mechanised corps level formations that were there previously. But the only major change was a heavy assault gun battalion was added. The tank brigade received some additional support formations. The mechanised brigades lost its anti-aircraft battalion. After defeating the German 1943 offensive, the Russians launched their own 1943 offensive from September to December 1943. The Russians once again attempted to use their airborne formations in their 1943 offensive, and this shows the structure from June 1943 onwards. At this scale, there was no visible changes, at least in terms of combat ability. The Russians, in order to compensate for their lack of experienced troops, concentrated their medium and heavy artillery into artillery divisions. While these still lacked the flexibility of German or Western artillery, they were highly effective in pre-planned area fire. The artillery divisions consisted of 3 light artillery battalions, 3 light howitzer battalions, 3 medium howitzer battalions, and 3 mortar regiments. It represented a significant amount of firepower. The infantry divisions had reached a new level of stability with only minor adjustments occurring. Some improvements in weapons did occur, and there was the beginning of manpower restrictions being replaced or mitigated with an increased number of automatic weapons. This was a common occurrence for most of the major powers. The standard infantry division of the time possessed 3 full-strength artillery battalions rather than 1 being a reduced-strength battalion. The infantry regiment did gain some additional heavy weapons but was otherwise unchanged from the previous org structure. The tank corps was reasonably stable. The big change occurring, particularly in October, was the increase in assault gun capability, improved tanks and a reduction in anti-tank guns. This was due to the changes in how these corps were being used. In the past, they were fed into a breakthrough, after which they advanced until they met a German counterattack. Thus, the anti-tank guns were critical. As the war progressed, the overcoming of enemy infantry strongpoints became more important. The tank corps used tank destroyers rather than anti-tank battalions. It's possible some corps used tank destroyers and other anti-tank guns. However, it may be a specific org change, as tank destroyers would have been much more useful than anti-tank guns for this type of formation. The mechanised brigade remained unchanged. The engineer battalion was beefed up and the anti-tank battalions were replaced with tank destroyer battalions, with the assault gun battalions getting heavy vehicles. The tank brigades were getting a high proportion of T-34 medium tanks as compared with light tanks, and their strength grew as a result. In November 1943, the anti-tank gun numbers were reduced, but otherwise the tank corps remained much the same. I'm guessing German aircraft were less of an issue in late 1943, and the anti-aircraft capability was reduced accordingly. At this scale, there were no changes to the corps level formations or the tank brigades. The only real change for this particular organisation was the motorised brigade lost its anti-aircraft battalion. The mechanised corps role was also evolving, as can be seen in this new TO&E for September 1943. Originally, these formations were designed to form a firm defence against German counterattacks, but they were increasingly being used to overcome German strongpoints once the breakthrough had occurred. Assault gun numbers went up significantly as a result. The mechanised corps traded in their anti-tank guns for more tank destroyers and assault guns. It should be noted that while the Su-76 could be used as assault gun, they were normally used as tank destroyers. The Su-122 and Su-152s were very effective assault guns and tank destroyers as well, if required. The mechanised corps lost its light artillery regiment, but this was compensated by the additional tank destroyer and assault gun battalions. The increased proportion of T-34 medium tanks versus the T-50, T-60 light tanks did boost the strength of the tank brigade. The mechanised brigade remains unchanged. From December 1943 to April 1944, the Russians launched a major offensive across the front line, starting with the north. Down south, the main strength of the Russian army was battling it out with Manstein, who performed well but could not stop the Russian juggernaut. By 1944, the infantry or rifle brigades were getting less important, and many were disbanded to allow their manpower to be directed to the more useful infantry or rifle divisions. The 1944 infantry or rifle brigade gained a SMG battalion but was otherwise unchanged. After a number of air landings which resulted in heavy losses, the Russians had determined the air landing brigades needed more heavy weapons, a lesson which most nations were required to learn through experience. The air landing brigade gained an anti-aircraft and anti-tank battalion. Unlike their many other formations, the Russians had determined the optimal structure for the artillery division early in the war and stayed with it. A lot of variation did occur based on the availability of artillery, however. As a result, there were no changes to the artillery division in 1944. By 1944, the manpower issues were beginning to seriously affect the combat capability of the infantry or rifle division. The Russians increased the number of SMGs or submachine guns, LMGs or light machine guns, and other heavy weapons to ensure firepower remained the same, but this was not keeping up with the manpower losses. The result of this manpower issue, even with all the additional equipment, was the infantry regiment continued to lose strength. Looking at the Tank Corps in January 1944, the changes that occurred then were minimal and improvements in equipment being the main impact. Apart from the motorcycle battalion, there were no changes to the Tank Corps support formations, mortar regiments, motorised brigades or tank brigades. The only real change which occurred, visible at this scale, was the motorcycle battalion was beefed up in terms of combat strength. In February 1944, the Mechanised Corps experienced some changes. The main trend, in terms of changes, was the increase in size and power of the self-propelled gun battalions, such as the Su-76, Su-122 and Su-152 battalions. Other minor changes also occurred in the support formation of the brigades. Apart from a minor change to the reconnaissance forces, there were no changes to the corps formations, mortar battalions. The light tank destroyer, medium assault gun and heavy assault gun regiments were dramatically increased in size, which was the main change for this TO&E change. The reconnaissance battalion was further beefed up. Reconnaissance was becoming more important. The light tank battalion, the medium assault gun battalion and heavy assault gun battalion experienced a dramatic increase in strength, at least a doubling. There was a minor adjustment in the tank brigade support formation, while the mechanised brigade support formations experienced a significant increase in strength. In the summer of 1944, the Russians launched a major offensive which destroyed the German Army Group's centre. This raged between May 44 and August 44. This was then followed up by a renewed offensive in the south and the collapse of the Balkan position, or the Axis position in the Balkans. This raged between August 44 and December 44. While previously exempt from manpower issues, by June 44 the Guards rifle or infantry divisions were being impacted seriously by the manpower shortage. As you can see by this chart or this diagram, even the Guards infantry divisions were experiencing a reduction in manpower in the infantry regiments. The addition of support formations assisted, but the overall strength did drop. The Tank Corps continued to be modified to adapt to its ever-changing roles, as you can see by this TO&E issued in June 44. The Corps Reconnaissance Battalion was increased in size yet again. As the Corps was involved in more complex exploitation activities, reconnaissance became even more important. Other than this, there was no real change. As you can see by this chart, the motorcycle battalion was beefed up again in terms of combat strength. This was caused by it being equipped with medium tanks and better armoured cars. In the latter period of 1944, in this particular case, August 1944, the Tank Corps was beginning to change into a formation not unlike a Western armoured division, with increased artillery being added to supplement the rocket artillery and mortars. One major issue with the Corps was a lack of indirect fire capability, and while this did not allow it to compete with the German Panzer Division, it allowed it to use indirect fire to overcome obstacles to some extent. The Tank Corps was beginning to receive new weapons and vehicles in such number the combat strength of the battalions were being affected. This included improved heavy 150mm armed assault guns or 152mm assault guns and the T-34-85 medium tank. In addition, an artillery regiment was added to the Corps. The heavy assault gun battalions received improved armoured vehicles, which increased its combat strength. The Tank Corps, received a light artillery regiment, increasing its indirect artillery strength. The tank battalions was finally receiving T-34-85 medium tanks in strength, which again increased its overall combat strength. As with the tank corps, the mechanised corps went through similar changes, as can be seen by this June 94 structure. While the mechanised corps was reasonably stable, it did begin to receive new weapons which had an impact on its combat strength. The mechanised corps support formations, mortar regiments and assault gun regiments were unchanged. Some minor changes occurred in the brigades. This is all in terms of organisational. The tank brigades did gain additional support formations as well as newer tanks that were deployed within it. The mechanised brigade lost support formations, but the tank regiments were dramatically beefed up. This assumed the mechanised corps was equipped with Russian tanks. In reality, many mechanised corps use American tanks, and these were considered more reliable. While a tank in a tank corps was not expected to last very long, this was not the expectation for the mechanised corps. In the final years of the war, the Russians invaded Germany itself, driving to the gates of Berlin. In April 1945, the Russians launched their final offensive, finally capturing Berlin and meeting the Western Allies. The war in Europe was at an end. In January 1945, the Russians disbanded a number of brigades, rifle brigades, and divisions, rifle divisions, in order to boost manpower in the remaining divisions. The one upside was an increase in experience, allowing the Russians to introduce or reintroduce light howitzer battalions and other more complex formations. The Russian infantry divisions were once again beginning to look like its older, more complex structure. The anti-aircraft and machine gun battalion were replaced in this division. The artillery was reorganised with a net increase of 1 battalion. A mortar regiment was also added. The infantry regiment remained the same, at least in terms of combat strength. The same changes occurred to the Guards rifle divisions, with these formations retaining their manpower levels more than the standard divisions. The Guards rifle divisions also gained the same additional assets. The anti-aircraft and machine gun battalions were replaced. The artillery was reorganised with a net increase of 1 battalion. A mortar regiment was also added. This shows the final form of the tank corps, which was utilised in the 1945 offensives. An interesting point was the Russian commanders decided not to use the new T-44 medium tank and remained with the T-34-85 tank, which was the most common medium tank at this point. The tank corps structure remained the same as 1944, but improved weapons and vehicles was having an impact on its combat strength. The heavy and medium assault gun regiments received new vehicles as well as being beefed up, increasing their combat strengths. The tank battalions were receiving more improved T-34-85 medium tanks, increasing their strength as well. This shows the final form of the mechanised corps, which was involved in the 1945 offensive, and it was becoming a rather unusual divisional-sized formation, unmatched by any other nation. In many ways, as the tank corps was developing, the requirements for the mechanised corps was reducing. However, this was not to affect it until after the war. Apart from the addition of a 76 M42 battalion, there was no changes to the corps structure, but improved assault guns did increase the strength of the assault gun regiments. Some of these regiments were equipped with the IS-2 heavy tank as well. A second anti-tank battalion was added to the mechanised corps support, which was equipped with the 76mm M42 guns, allowing them to be also used in an indirect fire role and assault role against entrenched infantry. New assault guns and increased support formations increased the strength of the medium and heavy assault gun regiments. Let's now look at how some of the key divisions and tank formations changed over the period of the war in terms of combat strength. Looking at the battalions in an infantry or rifle division up to May 1942, if we look at the infantry battalions, they experienced a drop in strength but otherwise have remained stable for the entire period up to May 1942. The divisional support and infantry regiment support did fluctuate at points, but apart from this remained reasonably stable. While the number of battalions changed dramatically, most other battalions remained reasonably stable, if weak by Western standards. From July 1942 to May 1945, the infantry battalion strength dropped at the end of the war, primarily due to manpower issues. Once again, apart from the adding and removal of support battalions, the battalion strength remained reasonably stable. If we look at the rifle regiments, we can see the impact of the change more clearly. There was a steady decline in the strength of the Russian Rifle Infantry Regiment from its pre-war strength to its final strength at the end of the war. For the tank corps, we will now divide our analysis into tank corps support troops and then the tank and motorised brigades. It's obvious that the support formations of the tank corps dramatically increased in numbers in the early formation period of the tank corps. Even in the latter period of the war, the support formations continued to grow in numbers and strength. This was the area the tank corps developed the most between its formation and the end of the war. Let's now look at the tank brigades. From its formation, the tank brigades grew in strength. The battalions themselves did not change much, but the brigade as a whole steadily grew in combat strength. This continued in the second half of the war as well, although much of the increase was caused by improved weapons in this particular case. If we look at the motorised brigades, they also grew steadily in strength during the first half of the war. This was not so much the case in the second half of the war. While the AA battalion was removed, the combat strength dropped, but after this point the motorised brigades did not change until the end of the war. The Russian army experienced the greatest change of any of the major nations due to its having the greatest challenges, but this tended to be at brigade or higher level. At battalion level there was a surprising lack of change in terms of combat strength, if not actual structure. And so this concludes episode 16 of my video series on organisation, in this case analysing the Russian army in World War II, specifically the estimated combat strength of the battalions which made up the brigades, divisions or corps. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.